Metaphor. What is a metaphor? A metaphor is a figure of speech which refers to one object by the words or phrases that describe another object. It is a figure of speech in which two things are made to be the same. That's why the words and phrases that describe one object describe the other as well. You may have heard it defined like this before. A metaphor is a comparison without using like or as. Get rid of that definition right now because it's wrong. Why? Short story, if you follow this definition, then you will identify certain similes, some types of similes, as metaphors. For more information on that, you can click the link in the description below or at the end of this video, and it'll take you on the video on similes, and you can learn more about them there. But this is the definition that you need to keep in mind. A metaphor is a figure of speech which refers to one object by the words or phrases that describe another object, because one object's really being turned into the other one. Here's an example. Great rose bushes of red bloomed on Victor's cheeks. So the idea here is that Victor is blushing, but it is not describing it as blushing. It is describing it as great rose bushes of red. That's describing the blushing. One object is being described by the words and phrases that describe the other object. And the blooming is describing how fast he turned red. When people blush, it starts slowly. You don't turn red in a second, it takes several seconds. So here, that process of blushing is being described by the words that describe flowers. So another object, blooming. So just like a flower blooms slowly, it starts off as a bulb, then becomes the actual flower. Here, that description is given to the act of blushing. So the blushing, that's one object, is being described by the words and phrases of the other object, which is blooming. That's how metaphors work. And when you think about it this way, there's really an idea that the one object, which is the blushing, is being turned into flowers. Of course, it's not literal because this is figurative language. Another example. All our words are but crumbs that fall down from the feast of the mind. So here, words are described as crumbs. One object, words, is described by the words that describe another object, crumbs. So the little drops that come from bread. And the mind's thinking is being described as a feast. So being described using different words than what normally apply. And again, the idea is the words and thinking are being turned into a feast with a lot of crumbs coming down from the table. Now, why do people use metaphors? What is their function? Well, there are several. We're going to discuss the four main types here. The first and primary way why people use metaphors is to beautify a way of speaking or writing. It gives beauty to a word. It gives beauty to speaking. It gives beauty to writing. That's why poetry uses metaphors. This is the primary function of metaphors. But then there comes another way. Usually, it can be used as a comparison. Not so much as similes, for example, but it can highlight a comparison. But it's to help people think in different ways. So, for example, if I'm talking about the mind and thinking, and the words that come out of the mind, because words are the results of our thinking, then I start thinking about these processes in a different way. Oh, it's like a feast. It's like crumbs. I look at it in a different way. So it's for creativity as well. Third way is to help people understand a concept, and that concept's usually difficult, so an idea that's usually difficult by a comparison. Again, for metaphors, not so much as, for example, similes. Similes help people understand much better than metaphors, but metaphors can also function in this way. And the last main way, so again, these are four main ways, there are others, these are the primary functions, is to provoke an emotional response. So if I say, for example, that blushing, I'm turning it into flowers blooming, that is a positive emotional response. It creates positive feelings because flowers are positive. They're given by people to the people they love. They are good to smell. They are pleasant to look at. So, oh, he's blushing, but it's so nice. He's blushing because he likes the girl, and this is really nice. That's positive. But if I, for example, turn his blushing into blood dripping all over his face, that creates a negative emotional response. So you can use metaphors to also create a sense of emotion in your hearers or readers that can create positivity or negativity. And this makes metaphors very powerful, because that way you're able to get people to not only think in a different way, but if you want them to think in a positive way or a negative way, you can do that as well. So these are the 4 most common functions of metaphor. So how do we identify metaphors? Well, it's a step-by-step process, and it works by questioning. So we have to ask ourselves 3 questions when we're reading a text to be able to identify a metaphor, or even if we're listening to a speech. Number 1, is there a comparison being made between 2 objects? So if the answer to this question is yes, we go on to a second question. But if it's no, then you're not really going to have a metaphor. Because a metaphor is a type of comparison. It's not really a comparison, but you can think of it that way. So if the answer is yes here, now you have to move on to a second question. So is one object being turned into another object? Or is one object being described with the words that describe another object? If the answer here is yes, you have a metaphor. But you can't stop here. There's one more question. So if there is an object being turned into another object, is that object being described as a person or being turned into a person? If the answer here is yes, now you have a different figure of speech, which is called personification. It's a type of metaphor, but it's a very specific type. You can't simply call it a metaphor anymore. So if the questions 1 and 2 have the answer yes, you have a metaphor. If all 3 of them are yes, you have personification. And if 1 is no, then most likely there's not going to be a 2. But in case you ask 2 first, you'll be alright. But if 2 is no, then you don't have a metaphor. So 1 and 2 have to be yes in order for it to be a metaphor. If 3 is answered yes, then now you have personification. So let's look at another example. It says, hard light bathed them, a whole nation of eyeless men. Let's ask ourselves the question. Question 1. Is there a comparison here between 2 objects? Well, yes, it says a hard light bathed them. Bathed here describes something besides light. There is a comparison. You can ask question number 2 first. Is one object being turned into another? And yes, if hard light is bathing people, that nation of eyeless men, then hard light is being described as water. It's being turned into water. So that is a metaphor. Let's try with another example. Go down the questions. It says, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances. So again, question 1, is there a comparison here between 2 objects? And the answer is yes. There is a comparison between the world and a stage. And by extension, the men and women and actors. Players here is an older way of saying actors in English. So the answer is yes to number 1. Let's go to number 2. Is the world being turned into a stage? And the answer is yes. It says the world's apostrophe S means is. So all the world is a stage. So it's being turned into a stage. And by extension, the men and women are being turned into actors. We go to question number 3. Is the world being turned into a person? The answer is no. Then you say, well, wait a second, the men and women are being turned into person. Well, yes, but they're already persons. So that's not personification. This is a metaphor. So the world's being turned into a stage. The men and women are being turned into actors. The entrances are being turned into births, and the exits are being turned into deaths. Because how do we enter and exit the world? Through birth and death. So this is a big metaphor right here. Trivium. Well, what's the word metaphor? Where does it come from, and why does it apply to this figure of speech? It's a Greek word, which means to carry over or to transfer. And this is because a metaphor transfers the words and phrases that describe one object to another object. So the description and phrases of one object are transferred onto the other object. They're carried over onto the other object. So that's metaphor. We see it here. I dream a world where love will bless the earth. Love is being turned into a person who is blessing. So the description of a person who is blessing, the verb bless, is being carried over. It's being transferred to love. Now, this type of metaphor is personification. Because if you remember, question number 3 says, is the one object, which in this case here is love, is it being turned into a person? Well, yes. The verb bless is something that only people do. So love is being turned into a person who is blessing. This here is an example of personification as well, which is a very specific type of metaphor. If you are interested in more, you can click here to go to other videos and topics that are related to metaphors. Thanks for watching. Until next time.